introduction. And actually, I'm going to embarrass you just as much by saying, do you remember where we actually met? We actually met in the bathroom at the Foundation Study Center in Cambridge. And I was going to begin by thanking Mitra for inviting me here to give this talk. You are also lucky to have her in your community. She is by far the most generous scholar I've ever met in this field, and one of the ones with the most integrity and brilliance. And she's a resource and a leader of us all. So thank you for having me here. It's really an honor to be here. So I'm going to present some thoughts today on what I guess is, I'm still thinking of as a new project, but which is a little bit farther along than it has been, about food nutrition and I hope the interesting terrains of late imperial economics in the interwar period in India. And I'm going to warn you that the part of this talk is coming out as an article, and the part that's really undigested is the part that you're getting. So this is a talk that's more about the evidence and the stories that I found in an archive rather than the ideas around them. So I'm really looking for feedback that helps me parse the political and economic ramifications of this moment. So please don't hold back. It will be really helpful for me to hear what you think as I take this work forward. So the history of food in India has until recently been divided rather evenly into a cultural history of food and its preparation and the history of its absence, say in times of famine. Missing from both the history and the historiography is a better sense of the relationship between food production and distribution and the greater structures of governance at work, ranging from histories of food regulation to the pragmatics and politics of food adulteration and the sale of food commodities. While the history of imperial trade, the connected histories of the Indian Ocean world, and the dynamics of the Bay of Bengal, and more recently the history of diasporic foodways, have laid the foundation for these sorts of inquiries, the shifting political terrain of 20th century Indian governance proves something of an impediment to thinking concretely about the history of food regulation in changing times. More recently, scholars like Benjamin Siegel and Janan Mukherjee have suggested that a political concern with food only becomes an issue for the Indian state after the famines of the 1940s, the moment at which an indigenous Indian government first addressed a food-related public health issue without input from the imperial state. This concern was articulated as a litmus test for nation building as the independent Indian government approached issues of scarcity, cultivation, and distribution of food on the national scale. The political history of food will no doubt build upon this moment at which human life was economized vis-a-vis its caloric intake. Before independence, the messy politics of interwar trade, in which provinces gained semi-autonomous decision-making capabilities, and the Raj began its political retreat, brought about possibilities for governance that responded directly to the demands of the market, as well as the lawmakers seeking to regulate the economy to better serve their citizens. At the center of this history is the unlikely commodity of vanaspati ghee, or clarified butter, which found itself in its variations at the center of Indian politics for both specious and weighty reasons. So today I'll chart the unlikely trajectory of ghee from a substance primarily relegated to the realm of the domestic or the spiritual into a commodity at the center of provincial legislative debates and mired in the tricky terrain of interwar international trade. However, before becoming the subject of peak transnational negotiation for a variety of governmental and industrial actors, vanaspati had to come into being as its own entity. Meant to stand in for the more luxe, expensive, more work-intensive ghee made of clarified animal fat, vanaspati offered a cheap, easy alternative in a convenient long-store package. The slippage from mimetic copy to marketable product involved a passage from substance to commodity, invoking a range of symbolic, religious, and ultimately technological changes that ushered in this modern kitchen staple. Its popularity and the convenience and ease with which it entered the market caused a minor uproar around its sale, with consumer protection, concerns about food adulteration, the politics of trade, and for the first time, a political consideration of the responsibilities of the state to its citizens as food consumers first and foremost. The shift from a substance to a commodity initiated the question of quality into legislative contexts as a decisively political issue, hinging broad policy upon what was, until this moment, generally worked out in the bazaar and the home. So I'll begin today by discussing ghee as a product, constructed in part by its symbolic meaning and reception in South Asian culture, and then as an object of political interest. I'll move on by looking at the ways in which the scalar politics of trade in the interwar period reveal the immense creativity and hybridity of the performance of governance in India. And finally, I'll move on to some thoughts about advertising and mass consumption in an age of economic turmoil. So to begin, clarified butter or ghee It's a hugely popular and culturally resonant, as well as very delicious food that serves multiple purposes in South Asian life. It's made by simmering butter so that the milk solids and the fat separate from each other. One frequently removes the residue so that the end result is a pure golden colored liquid that's then sometimes poured through a sieve, and you've got that picture over there, to further dislodge and remove any imperfections. Spices can be added to it during the process, and results vary depending on the amount of time that the butter spends cooking and the care with which the residue is removed. Ghee is traditionally stored in earthenware, airtight containers, like that one. Immediately upon cooking, a process that has historically required no refrigeration, making the precise and taxing task of making ghee a thankfully infrequent one. The primary use of ghee is culinary. It's added to rice, especially biryani, poured atop naans, and I just realized this is a terrible talk to give at noon.
We have samosas, we're good.
There you go. Poured atop naans and rotis, dolloped onto vegetables or meat curries, especially North Indian cuisine, and it's a main characteristic of Mughal cooking. The addition of ghee to a meal symbolizes wealth, opulence, and care. Butter is not a common fat used in the Indian diet, and until the 1950s was not widely available as a food commodity. To add ghee to a dish is to elevate it, both calorically and more symbolically to render it opulent. Scholars working at the University of Osaka, and I'm thinking here University of Osaka, have uncovered a series of competitions between the cooks of Delhi and those of Lucknow, both prominent centers of late Mughal culture and power, and have identified the nuttiness of the flavor and the golden quality of the color as key determinants in the winning ghee. Now, the secondary use of ghee is as a component of Hindu religious ritual, and by the way, happy Diwali to everybody. So ghee is an offering to murtis, or effigies of gods, there's Ganesha. Is a sound historic practice with roots in the Yajurveda, which dates back to about 1000 BC. It's included prominently in the Arti, or evening fire ceremony, and left in little vials as an offering for the household gods. It also has a strong presence in Ayurvedic medicine, or traditional Indian medicine associated with the origins of Hinduism as well. Firstly, for its rich dietary contribution, and also as a purifying substance appropriate for the non-digestive parts of the body. Ayurvedic recipes call for the addition of the live yogurt cultures cultivated in traditional dahi, or yogurt, that bolster the health benefits of the substance. A common practice for the diseases of the eye, for example, is the application of warm ghee directly onto the eyeball. And that guy has his eyes closed, but you can kind of see it happening. Taken together, ghee is a valuable food commodity whose richness comes not only from the value of its base component, but equally from the care taken to ensure its proper preparation. While it's used throughout the subcontinent and across religious and ethnic divides, the frequency of its use is class-based, given the expense of attaining proper butter, especially before the 1950s. Even in religious ceremonies, it can be substituted by cheaper, more readily available commodities such as honey or coconut or pressed oil. Cooking, too, can do without ghee, making it a desired, if not essential, component of the South Asian kitchen. Moreover, ghee is traditionally associated strongly with home, for the care in its preparation is such a major part of its value. Scholars of Hinduism, and I'm thinking here of Andrea Major in particular, Andrea Pinckney, goes as far as to suggest that to prepare it for puja or worship is itself a devotional act. An inquiry into the meaning of ghee offers up a fascinating paradox to its framing. Despite the focus on its slow and careful production, there is a wide berth for the inclusion around its materiality, which is to say that the broader category of ghee, which should rely on the particularities of authenticity and purity that we can track for other biomoral substances, just isn't asked to be as pure as other things are. One thing that struck me through my research into indigenous medical cultures and food and Indian history is the flexibility that a biomoral reading of substance allows. The metaphysics of humoral balance, environmental context, and chemical interaction are always already more important than the specifics of the ingredients, which are integral but for which scientific thinkers allow for substitution and replacement. For instance, the antibacterial bark called neem, used for millennia to brush one's teeth in the subcontinent, can be easily replaced with cloves and longa. If neem is unavailable, or the antiseptic haldi or turmeric also works against inflammation. So there's no one path to health or to God as we see with ghee. But the truth about the discourse on the purity of ghee is the widespread use of its other, the use of a wide variety of oils prepared in myriad ways to achieve the same clear substance that bears the import of imbued values of an elevated, worthy commodity. Well, this is true for cooking. It appears that it is equally true for religious worship and even for Ayurvedic modes of healing. So rather than adhering to purity, ghee is inherently a mixed substance defined as much by simulacra as it is by a labored over pot of clear butter. This becomes significant for us politically when ghee enters the sphere of imperial politics in the late 1920s, where it's not homemade butter ghee that comes under attack, but rather an approximation of it called Vanaspati ghee, which looks similar to butter ghee but was made out of vegetable and legume oils and processed to approximate the look and feel and taste of traditional ghee. Vanaspati is an ancient term referring in original Ayurvedic texts to trees that bear fruit, making Vanaspati the ghee that comes of fruit rather than of cows. Ghee is one of the first food commodities to cause any concern for the Indian state in its earliest incarnations. While imperial records show concern and attempts at regulation of a variety of the byproducts related to health, and I'm thinking here of Chalmukra oil or neem itself, the British colonial state left food mostly outside of the realm of governance. While medical historians have rightly claimed that the biopolitical reach of the colonial state stretched as far as the daily routines of Indian subjects, the specifics of food commodities have been largely left out of the conversation, even when dealing with the particularities of diet and everyday life. Now, broader consumption of spice, food combinations, healing properties, and dietary restrictions all come to construct the Orientalist framework of the Indian moral and physical constitution. At the same time, while the imperial state was invested in food commodities fit for export, like sugar or tea, colonial historians of famine emphasized the Raja's lack of concern with the daily eating habits of the Indian people, making commodities fit for consumption within India a non-priority for imperial rulers. There's one exception to this that kind of makes the point about the framework for adjudicating and legislating adulteration. Before ghee takes the stage in 1927, it's mentioned in reports of the Chemical Examiner's Office. Thank you, Mitchell, for the citation. An institution brought into being in 1849 after a series of deaths involving poisoning were brought before the British courts in Madras. The Chemical Examiner's Laboratory was a body that was, for all intents and purposes, a forensics lab set up for testing the substances suspected to have been altered and caused harm. The first was set up in Madras, and others followed in Calcutta, Agra, and Bombay. Eventually, there was a lab responsible for each province of British India, tied to a series of acts that were established to discipline the medical establishment in the 1910s. However, legal scholars like Mitra Sharafi have stressed the ties between the Chemical Examiner's Office and the legal system, arguing that its purpose was to serve the legal apparatuses of the state and not act in any way as a general regulatory body. So the specter of food adulteration is there, but the first substantial mention of ghee is in 1927 in the state of Punjab, where a debate was held in the Legislative Council about the counterfeiting and false sale of a product called Vanaspati. At the time of these debates in the late 1920s and 30s, Vanaspati varied widely in form. At times it was mixed with pure ghee to bring down the price, sometimes it contained no dairy at all, and in its most base form, paraffin, which is a kind of wax, was added to oil in order to bulk up the can and drive the price down further. The complaint raised in the Punjab legislature was that there was no standard method for identifying the contents of the Vanaspati ghee, meaning that the product varied widely from container to container, making it impossible to guarantee that its contents were safe. Moreover, the producers and distributors of the substance seemed little fazed by a Provisional Food Adulteration Act that had been introduced in 1919, and which legislators struggled to apply and implement across the province. Members of the legislature felt that the punishment meted out by the act, which amounted only to a small fine, was merely a preventative measure, but that the sale of Vanaspati was so lucrative that distributors would not be deterred by it. Later iterations of the debate revealed more details and more attempts to circumvent the problem, with members of the legislature approaching different kinds of potential allies. The most interesting of these attempted alliances was with a coterie of pundits, who the members felt might protest Vanaspati on the grounds of its impurities. But the pundits collectively defied the legislature, arguing that Vanaspati was a fine stand-in for pure butter and would help the lower classes to properly complete various forms of worship that had been off limits due to the cost of pure butter ghee. The members of the Punjab legislature opted to take the argument to the next level, which in this case they decided was the Indian Chamber of Commerce in Calcutta, in essence framing the question as one of consumer protection and calling upon a body they felt might feel for their plight. Their argument was that the white oil, Banaspati didn't carry the yellow cast of ghee, was being imported illegally from Germany and England and should be stopped. The chamber's hands were tied, as the import of white oil was not recorded separately from other imports and fell under the provisions for the application and exemptions of tariffs therein. The chamber simply had no framework for banning a product that didn't violate a treaty and with no verifiable risk associated to the public health. Moreover, the imported Banaspati varied so widely that it could not be conclusively deemed dangerous enough to investigate. The Chamber referred the province back to the Imperial Department of Education, Health and Lands to see if agricultural or health apparatuses of the central government had anything conclusive to say about the product. In fact, in a report issued by the Director General of the Chamber investigating the matter, it was found that some of the substances identified as harmful, including the liquid paraffin, were both used broadly in medical care and were often more expensive than the cost of the purity itself, making it very unlikely that they were being used incorrectly or in harmful quantities. So the takeaway from the early conversations about Banaspati ghee, where the substance is established as a commodity, was one of the lack of infrastructure for accommodating the growing body of products like this that were starting to circulate. They were mass-produced, lacked oversight, and they were beyond the purview of any one committee. And this is where we shift gears and move on to the broader political framing of this conundrum posed by ghee and its regulation. The other story to tell about the history of food regulation, and the one where I go out on more of a limb, is around the question of governance raised by the failures of these early debates. Each letter received or crafted by the Imperial Health Department, written in response to concerns about consumer protection, rather than the question of delegation, in response to concerns about consumer protection, raised the question of delegation. The first conversation, before the speculation about adulteration or quality or marketing or branding, was taken up with this question: whose decision is this? Empire, and think about it, as noted in White House, no longer changes in governance or sustainable after the imperial, especially given some of the loftier goals, the cost of dominant century of India, despite agitations for home rule. of this newfound reciprocity between government and citizen was abstract at best, it created the conditions to stage conversations about the role of governance in regulating the parameters of everyday life. The flavor of this arrangement is felt powerfully in the first conversations about ghee. Whose job was it to govern ghee? The files ending up in the imperial docket were themselves something of an anomaly. They were incorrectly directed to the Home Department, which had basically ceased to exist after the devolution of power and spent some time bouncing between the Departments of Health, Lands, Agriculture, and Business before the final decision was taken to deploy the question to the provinces directly. Following the geographer Stephen Legge, I find it most useful to think about these effects, these different loci of debate as being emblematic of scalar politics of space. The original imperial model of a tough center meting out decisions to provincial officials and appointed and elected to implement them was transformed in the early 1920s. This means that a request to a seemingly national body was a useless endeavor. The legislators of Punjab writing to the Chamber of Commerce in Calcutta was the start of a conversation, but the answer sought was about process rather than having a demand fulfilled. And the answer passed down from the imperial center was simple. This concern about food regulation, ranging from the details of its import from foreign shores to ways to determine its safety, was simply the jurisdiction of the provinces, once again elevating the importance of these makeshift legislative bodies quickly arranged in 1919. To quote an imperial commissioner in Delhi, I quote, "Prima facie, it seems to me to be absurd that the government of India should be asked to undertake drastic legislation of the nature suggested by the government of Punjab because the local government are unable or unwilling to enforce the existing law or try other expedients." This verdict passed down hastily from Delhi ends up being significant when one broadens the scale of politics following the more complex question of import and export activity. The members were correct in identifying the international market as a threat to the local economy and legal practices of Punjab. The concerns about the potential additives in foreign vanaspati and the demand that it be colored, like margarine, to change its appearance was sparking the interest of exporters around the world with a finger in the ghee game. Now, it seems that a big chunk of the market of vanaspati distributed in the subcontinent was actually produced at a factory in the Netherlands owned by the Vandenberg Group. A Dutch conglomerate with ties to South Africa and the British East Africa colony more generally. Nederlander agricultural products were processed and packaged in machines built with raw materials from the British Empire in East Africa, which secured the Vandenbergs a sweet contract to be the major importers of faux dairy to the Indian colony and other outposts. Among the first to respond to the question of adulteration brought up at the Health Council was actually S.N. Little, a London bureaucrat writing on behalf of the Vandenberg Company, who offered to send a representative to India during the hot season. The letter was actually penned in February because they would usually sort of take the time to come in the fall when the monsoon and the heat was over. But the matter was of such expedient urgency that they decided they would brave the May heat. The company was concerned that in calling out vanaspati and insisting it be dyed like margarine, this would ensure that Indian consumers who could not afford to buy pure butter would feel lesser than and would view the vanaspati ghee as an inferior product. What's perhaps most interesting about this case is the speed at which industry, through the representative of a private investing firm based in London, came to the call of the Indian citizen subject, privileging the reading of the masses as consumers first, rather than colonized subjects of empire. The language of the documents found in the records of the Health Department for this issue was cast by Punjab as a case of fraudulence, with maximum impact upon one's health and only secondarily upon the wallet, stand out from others by considering it all the subjective experience of the individual as embodied subject and a subjective consumer. His health, his pride, his rational decision-making abilities, his affective relationship to the market, all of these are exceptionally well articulated by the people at Vandenberg. Industry, of course, had its bottom line to consider, and India proved a large and growing market for manufactured goods. The state, in its liberal idiom, was expected to step in and mediate that relationship between the right of the citizen as consumer and the responsibilities of its office to the colonized subject to ensure good, nutritious food products. And so it was determined the vanaspati would be artificially colored, and also that a market for it, not as ghee, but on its own terms, would be fostered. The irony here is that, having been at first dismissive of the issue, the Raj comes begging to get in on the action once the Vandenbergs make their visit. The direct contact between representatives of the Punjab legislature and the Vandenbergs' firm called Dada strengthened ties between the two entities, worked to improve the passage of goods from the Netherlands to Punjab, and finally resolved the question of food coloring, thus ensuring a modicum of safety control for Indian consumers. In fact, the conversations progressed so smoothly that two other possibilities arose from them. The first was a replication of this particular trade agreement for other provinces, and the second was the acquisition of some of the resources used by the Dada firm from Punjab itself in order to cut down on the resources purchased in East Africa. It was this latter part that raised a red flag for the imperial government. While the province of Punjab could act autonomously enough on the broader arrangement of empire to secure a trade agreement of this nature, the same was not true for East Africa, where a more hegemonic and severe colonial presence still retained control over agreements of this nature. It was an embarrassment to the imperial government, and the peons sent from Delhi to Chandigarh were literally forced to beg legislators there to back out of the deal in order to preserve the economic balance of empire. The legislators in Punjab, in a very satisfying moment for post-colonial historians, did not heed the concerns of the Raj and went ahead with the deal. So finally, to account for the third political question, which also arises from this arrangement with Vandenberg's Dada firm, one of the arguments lobbed about in the Banaspati debates in the Punjab was the suggestion that a campaign begin to force the Raj to act to control ghee by making the case that the spread of this alleged contaminated Banaspati ghee beyond the borders of Punjab could result in a public health problem on a large scale. In their eyes, this was an issue of national concern for the citizens of India. Under whose jurisdiction, however, did a potential harm to citizens fall? Darghi had relegated concern for the longitudinal problems of private citizens to the provincial systems of governance. However, the affective work of Indian nationalism, not to mention the fast spread of industry in this period, demanded a broader audience and a national response. The problem for Punjab was that the mechanisms didn't exist to negotiate cross-provincially. The provinces had a degree of autonomy from the center, they couldn't barter with each other. Decisions had to volley through the central government in Delhi. Ultimately, after the Dada Agreement had been forged, another plan took its place that addressed the rigidity of the provincial line as an unshakable boundary. Legislators in Punjab reversed the proposal they had initially posed as a problem. With the question of due diligence sorted out by Dada, the Punjab government now wondered if instead of stopping the spread of Dada's Banaspati into the neighboring provinces, why not try selling it? Why not act as the intermediary between Dada and the United Provinces of Agra and Abid on the other side of the border? And here we find the balance and the brilliance and innovation of this moment. What the ghee debates bring to light are the experimental capacities for governance that see Punjab province acting as an international trade entity to which the Raj must kowtow, as an arbiter of the completely uncharted waters of grand-scale interprovincial trade, and also as a standalone political entity empowered to regulate the goods and services offered to its citizens. Here, the province, rather than the central government of India, was in the position to profit, with economic urgency shaping the much slower legal apparatuses that were adapting to regulate the market. And here I'm thinking about Ritu Birla's work on the way in which economy shapes the law. So the final part of the story of ghee, and I promise it's going to get fun again, is the cultural history of its transformation into a popular product. Buttressing the transformation of the political mechanisms through which to enact change was the challenge of presenting the product as a desired commodity. Dada Banaspati, which found its strong base in the late 1920s Punjab, became the dominant mass producer of ghee in modern South Asia and its diaspora. The Dada Company helped to incorporate Hindustan Banaspati Manufacturing Company in 1931 in order to have a foothold in India to explore the possibilities of producing ghee there. In 1932, 4 Dutch companies, including the Vandenberg's Dada firm, merged with the British firm owned by the Lever brothers to form Unilever, the world's first conglomerate and the largest producer of margarine and soap products globally. In India, the Levers insisted that the name reflect the partnership, and hence the Dalda Company was born. And this is probably a logo that's familiar to a lot of us. So the challenge for Dalda was to raise the stakes and convince more and more of the Indian public to buy the product. This is the most resonant and familiar part of the story of Banaspati, but this is the biggest challenge, the one won most successfully. The history of advertising in India is strongly linked to the further solidification of class identity among the Indian bourgeoisie in the interwar period, along with the evolution of branding and the introduction of brand name ready-made goods develops in part to serve them. The struggle to market ready-made goods to both serve the perceived needs of the population and to stimulate the steady growth of consumption was in essence a struggle to overcome the lure of the easily accessible and affordable presence of the bazaar where fresh goods could be obtained. The lure of luxurious or limited goods can adopt an effect of the unattainable, but products that aim to replace goods, easily conjured or created by bizarre purchases, remain to harder sell. The introduction, I'm thinking here of things like tea bags. Like, you don't need a tea bag when you buy tea. You don't need a curd paste or ghee in a can when you can make it yourself. So the introduction, branding, and marketing of prepared food products that already circulated widely in unbranded forms posed a particularly vexing problem to advertisers as consumers had to be taught to purchase them. And Dalda led the way by creating advertisements for canned banaspati that they hoped would appeal to the masses. So the advertisement here bears pictures of fresh fruit and vegetables laid out on a very basic looking thali, somewhat obfuscated by the image of fresh produce as a cookbook, and the Dalda cookbook in India and Pakistan becomes one of the most important kind of documents around cooking in the Indian 20th century. The cookbook, which bears the name of the company and features a tin of the ghee, a tiny image of a woman, her arms spread over the large corner of the book, strives to open its pages, and this is another theme, women trying to read is big for Dalda. Atop this image is a slogan in large bold print reading, it will build strength, that's up there, the slogan. Also featured across the text of the advertisement is a woman in a sari to signify the mother, looking down at a group of boys running towards her. Placed across from her is a man, legs spread, hands firmly on hips and chin facing upwards. Clearly he's meant to be the father and the instigator of the family's shift in consumption. Lower down the page, the toothy grin of a boy is featured, with a cartoon bubble in which he informs the reader that father says that this will invigorate me, and indeed this was the slogan of the company, for invigoration. Dalda continued to innovate in the field of advertising. Here's another lovely Dalda ad from the 1950s. In 1937, Dalda hired Harvey Duncan of the Lintus Ad Agency, which was the in-house firm of believers in London, to create a campaign for the product that ended up radically changing the culture of advertising. So beyond ads in magazine, Duncan developed stalls set up to sample Dalda and distributed detailed leaflets with information about how to use it and recipes to try. But the biggest innovation was a filmed advertisement that was shown before talkies in Bombay. The film was projected onto a specifically crafted van that was built round to reflect the shape of a can of Dalda Vanaspati. Duncan's minions would actually drive this kind of can van around rural areas to appeal to people in small towns and larger villages, making Dalda a product that was relevant beyond the middle class, and one of the only, or one of, not the only, but certainly one of the first commodities that really we can understand the working classes to buy along with the middle and upper middles. The plan worked. Dalda remained unchallenged through the 1980s as the dominant manufacturer and seller of Vanaspati ghee. The liberalization of the Indian economy in the 1990s saw the entry of new food products and technologies, as well as a shift towards using straightforward pressed plant oil that grew in popularity in this time of change. However, beyond the success of the company, which expanded in time to cover a wider range of food commodities in which I can buy in my little grocery store in downtown Montreal, Dalda's success was marked by its complete appropriation of the product, which was now transformed from a useful commodity to an essential part of the modern Indian kitchen. With this turn towards the mass marketing of the product, Vanaspati lost the flexibility of the biomoral symbolism allotted to it by the pundits of yore and became quite simply cooking oil, with Vanaspati most commonly known as Dalda. This early commercial history of ghee poses a good entry point to thinking about the evolution of state politics and the beginning of state involvement in alimentary affairs, precisely because it makes demands on government that it was not quite set up to handle. It raises a series of questions that strike to the heart of the problems of interwar governance. What was the responsibility of the government pertaining to the private lives of citizens, and especially regarding their embodiment? Was it possible for provincial governments to even attempt to account for and regulate the vast expanse of food production? How could taste and desire be gauged in rational terms, and how could authenticity and fraudulence be measured? What measures of surveillance and discipline could be effectively applied? Both industry experts and state officials were essentially asking the state to operationalize a regulatory system for food that the state had yet to create, and yet industry continued undeterred, and Vanaspati ghee, tea bags, powdered milk, baby formula, and other controversial food commodities flourished in this era and became the backbone of the Indian food economy. Essentially, the story of ghee makes evident the wild creativity and exciting possibilities for governance and for food economies at a moment when neither were fully formulated or pinned down. The scalar triangulations of government in the diarchic moment and in the iterations of government that came afterwards reveal the autonomy of the provinces of British India and their economic and legislative endeavors in what was becoming a freer global marketplace. less more by the rigidities of imperial control. Rather than seeing this period as one of political loss, we must turn to it with a close watch on the intertwined histories of market development, food production, and creative governance to make the case for its dynamism and also its centrality to stories untold about the Indian masses and savvy consumers at play in a global marketplace. Ultimately, Punjab province's attempt to regulate and sell ghee revealed the way in which it stood at the center of a complex constellation of regulative bodies emerging as a standalone entity in an imperial and extra and post-imperial world. Thank you.
Shall I just let
Please,
you
yeah.
take questions? So I know some people have to leave at 1. I think we like to start with
People that have to leave
people that have to
early,
leave
yes.
early. If you don't mind, we can let you go first.